Today, we're going to talk about a couple of topics with regard to COVID vaccines that I've been thinking about a fair amount lately. I made a video about the coronavirus pandemic recently, so this will be fun. And before we get started, don't forget to like the video on the YouTube channel and to click on the bell to get notified for more, and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also scroll down when you're on the channel, find my website, and then find all the different things that are on there. In particular, if you click on the writing tab, you'll find all the classic papers in immunology. So you can check to see whether or not my bias is really true or whether it's flawed. I want to deal with two issues that have to do with coronavirus vaccines. One is I want to talk about the difference between public health and personal health. And also, I want to talk about these new messenger RNA vaccines, because I think a lot of the vaccine hesitancy out there has what people say when they say why they don't want to get a new vaccine. This vaccine is that, well, it's so new and we don't know what's going to happen and so forth and so on, which is, in the large historical context of introduction of new medicines and techniques in medicine, a fair amount of skepticism is a good thing. But these messenger RNA vaccines are really a huge breakthrough in biomedical science. And it's almost as important as the gene editing technique of CRISPR-Cas9. So I thought we should just dwell on what these things are for a second. So the thing about all life forms that we know about so far on Earth are steeped in nucleic acids. And there are basically two types of nucleic acids that you want to know about. One is called DNA and the other one's called RNA. And together, these two kinds of molecules, carry all the information. They're like the big computer in your cells, or the small computers in your cells, and they code for everything that a cell does. And so the first important thing to think about in terms of our DNA and RNA is that these are biological molecules that are in every life form. And consequently, they are not necessarily toxic. And like some other molecules from the environment might be toxic to the human body, these are part of us. We will recognize the fact that, oh yeah, I know these guys. They're like a couple of gangs, the Hatfields and the McCoys or whatever. The general flow of information from these molecules in our cells is what used to be called the central dogma, which meant that, and what's Francis Crick coined the term, the central dogma is, and that was that information only flowed one way, and that was from the DNA, which is in the nucleus of the cell, to the RNA, and then from the RNA to products, proteins primarily, and as well as other things. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA comes from ribonucleic acid. So it's deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. Just a little bit of a difference between those two molecules, but it makes the molecules very, very different in terms of how they behave. Now, about 15 or 20 years ago, it was discovered, and I think even accidentally, that if you add DNA to cell cultures, that can become incorporated into the cell and eventually find its way to the nucleus of the cell and actually become expressed in the cell, so that the information that comes from that DNA can get out into the cell and then beyond. And people wanted to try to see if they could use this to make vaccines, because then you wouldn't have to. Up until that point in time, one of the major ways to make a vaccine was to manufacture large quantities of the product of the gene. And if you could just use the gene, that would be maybe just as good, if not better. And DNA is a very stable molecule, so that it's very easy to work with in the laboratory and beyond. The problem is that it wasn't a very efficient way to make a vaccine. And it really hasn't gone anywhere in the last 15, 20 years. And now RNA is the nucleic acid that's found in the cytoplasm of the cell. And when the DNA, well, it's found in the cytoplasm because when DNA and the information in the nucleus is transcribed into RNA, which means just like a monk in the abbeys way back in the Middle Ages, transcribing, copying and manuscripts from one to another. That's exactly what DNA and RNA do. DNA transcribes the information into RNA, and RNA then leaves the nucleus, goes out into the cytoplasm, and then that information that's now in the RNA is copied and into products. And the products are proteins. Proteins are very different molecules from the nucleic acids, and they're made out of different building blocks than the nucleic acids are. And there's 20 different building blocks that are called amino acids, and they are combined in a whole bunch of different ways to make all the myriad forms that gives us our personal characteristics and makes for all the different life forms out there in the big bad world. And so people tried to make vaccines out of RNA, but RNA is, in contrast to DNA, RNA is a very finicky molecule. There are things that are called RNases, which are things that are ubiquitous in our environments, on our fingertips. They're in our serum. They're all over the place. And what they do, if they see an RNA molecule that doesn't look like it's supposed to be in this neighborhood, they glom onto it, they chop it up into little pieces, and that's the end of that. And so RNA was difficult to administer to try to make a vaccine out of it. And so the story that led to these messenger RNA vaccines goes back more than 15 years, when people started tinkering around with the RNA molecule to solve some of the problems that are associated with using it as a potential vaccine preparation. And one of the first things they did was they looked at, there are RNA molecules inside cells that are not broken down and that are not recognized and broken down inside the cell. So that if you could get it inside the cell, maybe it'd be okay. One of the problems was getting it inside the cell in the first place, so it didn't get chopped up in the serum or wherever you put it into the body. So they found that they knew that there was a molecule that was called ribosomal RNA that was part of the machinery of copying the information in the messenger RNA, and that wasn't a problem for the cell. And so they looked at the structure of that, and they found that there were building blocks within the ribosomal RNA that conferred its sort of immunity to the cell, and so that the cell would recognize that, okay, this is okay, he's a ribosomal RNA and he's okay, and we don't have to deal with him. If RNA from a virus or a bacteria or from another human being or whatever else finds its way inside of a human being, what happens is that the cells recognize that this RNA is foreign, and it starts an immune reaction. And one of the first things it does is that it activates the system to start making a molecule called interferon, which is a cytokine, interferes with viral replication, because now what's going on is that the cell thinks that this is a virus, whether it's thinks it's viral RNA, and immediately stops the production of this, or stops this whole thing by producing interferon. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds in all this, but they figured out a way to masquerade the messenger RNA as if it was ribosomal RNA, and that solved one of the problems, because then you didn't start chewing it up and breaking it down and so forth inside the cell. Now, the second thing that they found, and that the first paper in this that's recognized now goes back to 2005, so that's 16 years ago. So this isn't a new phenomenon. This has been people, the basic scientists, thank God for them, have been working on this for quite some time. The second thing that they found is that they could engineer the messenger RNA so that the cell would not recognize it and shut down protein synthesis. That's another thing that would happen if the cell thought it was being attacked by a virus. And that meant that protein synthesis could just keep on going. Once you got the thing inside the cell, then it can just replicate and replicate and replicate all kinds of gene products. Now, gene products are good if you want that to be an antigen, say the coronavirus spike protein, which is on the surface of the virus. And so the other thing that they found was that with that protein then being cranked out in a much higher, 1,000-fold higher levels, and for much longer, for a couple of weeks, and therefore you don't have to have it. You just put a tiny little bit of the messenger RNA vaccine into the body, and it's like a little factory. It's almost like a virus in and of itself, but it isn't really a virus because it doesn't replicate, which is one of the other aspects of life forms. They've got to not only do things, but they also have to replicate themselves. The fact that you can get this protein production over a long time period, relatively a long time period, meant that you got a very big stimulus on the immune response, both the T cell immune response as well as the B cell immune response. And so I think everybody now has been steeped in the idea that we have to have antibodies, and the antibodies are protein molecules that the immune system makes that react to the antigens or to the vaccine. And so this is all very good. This makes for a really good vaccine. And I think the final thing with regard to this whole thing is that these vaccines are made in the chemical laboratory. By comparison, the older vaccines, going back 200 years to Edward Jenner, that we started with a smallpox vaccine, for the most part, those are living molecules, living beasts, and you've got to grow them up in tissue culture or grow them up in a biological laboratory. These RNA vaccines, you make them in a chemical test tube. That means that you can do it much, much faster. And all you need are the chemical ingredients, the building blocks, and the know-how to make those building blocks build appropriately. And you've got yourself a vaccine much, much more rapidly than all this other stuff. When they talk about, usually takes 14 years to get a vaccine, and the fastest one out was the mumps vaccine that only took 4. Well, that's because those were biological processes. This is a chemical process. This is much more amenable to a pandemic that's when you've got 7 billion people in the world that you've got to vaccinate. So that all makes us, we're lucky people to have these vaccines. That's all I can say. And so any vaccine hesitancy and so forth and so on just shouldn't be a problem at this stage of the game. And so I think if people are unvaccinated, the onus is on them to find out as much as they possibly can about all these different vaccines and what it's all about and how the immune system works and the whole deal. Because the more you know, the better off you are. And that brings me to the second point that I've been cogitating about over the past time period. And that is, this pandemic is a pandemic because this virus is an aerosol virus. This virus is passed on through the air. And one of my pet peeves is that the officials that we all depend upon in our governments and so forth, not only ours, but all over the world, sort of didn't really come to grips with the fact that this virus is transmitted through the air. That is, it's not just droplets of visible droplets of water coming out of your mouth when you sneeze or when you cough, and that would justify the six foot social distancing rules. This viral particles are tiny little things, and you can release, if you're infected in your nasopharynx and in your lungs with this virus, just by breathing, you're releasing viral particles out into the air. And I think I mentioned in one of the other videos is that in order to understand that, the easiest way to discuss it and to think about it is the fact that if you're a non-smoker and you go into a room that somebody has smoked in, just doesn't even have to be recent, you immediately know that there's smoke in that room because you can smell it. That's what happens with this virus. Only difference is we can't smell the virus, and so we don't know it's there. So that's why it's been so contagious, because it's transmitted through the air. And there's two other viral infections that are very similar to coronavirus. One is smallpox, transmitted through airborne particles in the air, and the other one is measles. Now, smallpox we eradicated across the world by 1980, which was a huge public health thing. Measles is still around all over the world, particularly in poor countries, and also countries that are undergoing wars and civil wars and so forth. Measles is very, very contagious, and the thing is, everybody grew up from the 1950s on having to get a measles vaccine in order to go to school. So all of the adults, at least in our country, are already immunized, vaccinated against measles. So consequently, we have herd immunity to measles. That means that there's enough people within the population that are immune, so that even if you introduce somebody that's infected into the community, if a certain fraction of those people are already immune, then the virus can't replicate, because it can't find another host to get into before it's eradicated from the initial host, essentially. For measles, you need 95% of the people to be immune. Well, of course, greater than 95% have been immune because they got vaccinated before they could go to school. And since everybody went to school, there weren't very many homeschooled people at that stage of the game, we've had 95% immunity to measles until recently, in the past 10, 15 years. And then the anti-vax people has got into the mix. And the story that I like so much is that a few years ago in California, where we have all these pinko liberals out there that don't want to have the government tell them what to do and so forth. And I smile a little bit because I'm one of those pinko liberals, but not when it comes to vaccines. They started not vaccinating their children because they worried about all the vaccines that these kids were being given and so forth. And the vaccination rate in different communities in Florida fell below 95%. And what happened was, there was somebody that was infected, probably from an overseas family or individual, that in Disneyland, there was an outbreak of measles in Disneyland. And it was because there were enough people, Americans, wandering around Disneyland who were not vaccinated. And so the virus was passed from one individual to, say, 5 or 6 individuals, and then those 5 or 6 individuals went home and passed it on and passed it on, and that's an outbreak. That's what we're seeing all over the world now in coronavirus. And in the coronavirus story, we're seeing that because of the fact that there's still a huge fraction, 25, 30, 40% of the population is unimmunized. They are susceptible. And as long as the virus is circulating within the community, those individuals are becoming infected, and they're infecting other people. And that's why now what's going on is people are saying, well, we're not going to ever get to herd immunity. Or even worse kind of thing is that, well, herd immunity doesn't work. Well, herd immunity does work, but you need, with something like measles and something like coronavirus and something like smallpox, you're going to have to get higher than 90%, probably higher than 95% of the people vaccinated. And now with our political situation in the United States, that ain't going to happen. And that means we're going to be living with this virus for quite some time. Probably it's going to have to become generational, essentially, which brings me to the fact that coronavirus is not just a personal health problem, and you just don't have personal health freedom with coronavirus. It's also a public health problem. And what is public health? If you look it up in the dictionary, public health is stated that it's the ability of the society to try to prevent disease, not treat it, to prevent it. And it came out of Edward Jenner and the smallpox vaccine, and it came out of a very famous case or a situation in London back in the 1850s, whereby there was a well contaminated with cholera bacteria that they realized by doing epidemiological experiments that this well was contaminated with something. They didn't even know, that was before we knew about bugs, bad bugs, microbes. Anyway, public health has come into being because it's a societal problem. And so when you have a public health problem, you don't have the freedom, the individual freedom of choice. It's a public health problem. And therefore, if you want to participate in a public activity, such as going to work, going to school, going to a restaurant, going to a bar, going to the theater, and so forth and so on, then you got to be vaccinated, because we have a preventative for this particular infection, which is the vaccine. So it's not just your choice to not take that vaccine. You can take that choice and not become vaccinated, but then you can't participate in the society, because it's a societal public problem that has to be dealt with. And if we don't deal with it, then we're not going to have the public freedom that we had before the pandemic started, of being able to collect and to congregate into groups, small, big ones, and so forth and so on, and have freedom of movement throughout the society. And all of those things have been curtailed and are going to continue to be curtailed at different kinds of degrees, unless the society, and I hate to use this word, mandates that, and non-mandates that you have to become vaccinated. We'll give you that, but mandates that you can't participate with the rest of the people in the society. You have to stay home and learn how to knit, I guess. And so that's really the bottom line. And I don't understand why the government hasn't already done that, but I don't know all the rules and all the laws on the books and so forth, but I've been assuming that there must be some reason that they haven't explained to the populace what I just explained. And so I think it seems to be right now, it's happening without new laws, essentially. The president of the United States has now said that, well, if you're going to have a company that's bigger than 100 employees, you can't come to work if you're not vaccinated. And that seems to be occurring. And so that's good. I think eventually we're going to increase the percentage of people who are vaccinated within the society. But I assume that we're never going to reach the degree that we need in order to have herd immunity, because it's going to be 95%, just like measles. So I will stop there, and don't forget to like this video. I'm a little bit more animated today than I have been, and when I'm just reviewing papers, but I've been thinking about these problems and questions for quite some time. So like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the papers on the website and the other kinds of things. And I've been tweeting a lot on Twitter, so check out my Twitter feed as well. So it's been good. Thank you.